By the time the fog lifted off the Smoky Mountain ridgeline in late October of 1981, 5 men were already being hunted, and none of them had planned to hurt anyone. Not when the night began, not when the trucks first rolled, not even when it became clear the dog wasn't coming back. A brindled hunting hound, worth less than a used rifle and more than most men's pride in that part of Tennessee. And by dawn, the search had stopped being about finding anything alive. Because the first thing everyone understood, without saying it out loud, was that the dog hadn't wandered. It had crossed into the wrong hollow or been taken. And in the Smokies, a missing dog wasn't a loss. It was an accusation. And accusations didn't wait for proof, especially not in a place where the woods swallowed sound and the dirt roads bent away from maps, where families had settled arguments for generations without writing anything down, and where the sheriff knew the names involved before his phone rang, but also knew better than to drive up there alone. Because by the second hour, word had already spread through feed stores and back porches, not as a rumor but as a certainty. And certainty hardened fast. Faster than daylight. Faster than reason. And it didn't matter that no one had seen who last handled the dog. It didn't matter that 2 men swore they heard it running after dark. What mattered was that one family had lost something they depended on, something that guarded their land and tracked their game. And losing it meant someone else had crossed a line that wasn't drawn on any deed. And by mid-morning, names were being spoken quietly, never written, never repeated twice, and each name added weight to the air, because every man knew what being named meant. And by afternoon, trucks were moving the ridgelines not to search, but to watch. Headlights cut early, engines left running. The mountains doing what they always did, closing in. And by the first night, a man who hadn't touched. The dog didn't come home. His wife noticed the silence before the neighbors did, and when she asked around, she was told nothing had happened yet, which was how people there said something had already gone too far. And by the second night, no one expected the sheriff to intervene because he'd already been warned off in a way that didn't sound like a threat, but carried more weight than one. And by then it was understood that even if the dog were found alive, it wouldn't stop what had started. Because this wasn't about the animal anymore. It was about who had been seen where, who had spoken too quickly, who had failed to deny something when denial was still possible. And as the nights stacked up, men moved through the forest the way they always had, slow, familiar, silent, using old trails that never appeared on county surveys. And one by one, people stopped showing up to work, to church, to breakfast counters. And no one asked why, because asking meant choosing a side, and choosing a side meant being seen. And by the fourth night, the mountains had settled into the rhythm of it. Fog rising and falling, trucks idling and leaving, voices low. The understanding that the woods were doing what the law could not. And somewhere in all of it, the dog remained missing, not searched for, not mentioned again. Because in the Smoky Mountains in 1981, the worst mistake wasn't killing over a dog. It was pretending that was ever what the hunt had really been about. By the 5th day, the weather turned, rain settling into the valleys and washing tracks from the softer ground while leaving the higher paths untouched. And the men who were moving knew exactly where to walk, so they wouldn't leave anything behind. Because this was not a chase driven by speed, but by patience. And patience was something the mountains taught early, and by then the list had narrowed without ever being agreed on. 5 names spoken less often now. Not because they were forgiven, but because saying them no longer changed anything. And the second disappearance happened closer to a road, close enough that someone heard a truck idle too long and looked out through a window without turning on a light. Close enough that a body should have been found if anyone had wanted it found. And the sheriff wrote nothing down because there was nothing to write that wouldn't come back on him. And because everyone involved had cousins, brothers, hunting partners, and because solving it would have meant standing between people who had already decided the outcome. And by then, the men still alive understood the rules had shifted, that staying home marked you just as clearly as running, that asking for help outside the county was the same as confessing, and one of them tried to leave before dark, packed light, took a road he hadn't driven since he was a teenager, and made it less than 3 miles before he turned around. Not because he was stopped, but because he knew the truck behind him had been there, too long to be coincidence. And by the 7th night, no one was pretending this was a search anymore. The woods were quiet in a way that only comes when animals stop moving first. And when a third man failed to come back, the reaction was almost relief, because it confirmed what everyone already suspected, that the count was moving forward whether anyone approved of it or not, and people adjusted their routines accordingly, locking doors earlier, keeping children inside, not out of fear of violence but out of respect for it. And somewhere during that week, someone finally mentioned the dog again, quietly, asking if it had ever been found, and the answer came back flat and immediate, that it didn't matter, that it never had, and that if it did turn up, it would only make things worse, because then someone would have to explain why they hadn't stopped. And by the 9th night, one of the remaining men made a mistake born of exhaustion, stepping into a clearing he'd avoided his entire life, thinking the rain had given him cover, not realizing that rain sharpened sound in those woods, and the shot that ended it wasn't heard far, wasn't meant to be, and the mountain took it the way it took everything else. And by the time the final 2 were accounted for, the community had already moved on in practical ways. Fields tended, stores opened, church bells rung. The kind of normal that only exists when everyone agrees not to talk about what made it necessary. And when a federal agent asked questions months later, he was told the same story by different mouths, that there had been trouble, that it had settled itself, and that there was nothing left to find. And he left with empty notes and a sense that pressing harder would only close doors permanently. And years later, people would still say it started over a missing dog, because saying that kept the truth small enough to live with. But no one ever went back into those hollows to look for it. Not once, because in the Smoky Mountains, what was really lost that week was not something that could be brought home on a leash. In the years that followed, the details blurred the way they were meant to, edges worn down by repetition until only the outline remained. And the outline was safer than the truth, because it allowed people to say it had been unfortunate rather than inevitable. And the men who survived learned quickly which roads to avoid and which names not to say out loud. And the sheriff retired without ever reopening the file that never existed. And the few reports that reached Nashville were categorized as disappearances consistent with terrain and lifestyle, which was how paperwork learned to sound like the mountains themselves, neutral and final. And when outsiders passed through, they were told stories that ended early, cut short with shrugs and phrases like, "That was a different time," as if time alone had done the killing. And the families involved marked anniversaries quietly, not of deaths but of absences. Chairs left empty long enough to stop being noticed, and the land absorbed what it had been given. Fences repaired, trails grown over, clearings reclaimed, until even locals had trouble pointing out where anything had happened. And once, years later, a hiker found a rusted collar half buried near a stream and brought it into town, asking if anyone recognized it, and the room went still in a way that told him everything without answering him at all. And the collar disappeared before morning, returned to the woods or burned or buried deeper, because finding it would have forced a conversation no one was willing to have. And that was the final understanding that settled over the Smoky Mountains, that the violence hadn't been about a dog or even about the men who vanished. It had been about order being restored according to rules older than law, rules that didn't forgive mistakes and didn't stop once they began. And so the story survived only as a warning, disguised as a joke, something people said with a half smile to test who was listening. That back in '81 men killed over a missing dog. Because saying it that way made it sound irrational, accidental, small, and what no one ever said, what no one needed to, was that in that place, at that time, once the hunt started, there was never any other way it could have ended. What remained after that was not memory, but behavior, a set of quiet adjustments that told newcomers where not to linger and told old-timers exactly how much silence was expected of them. And over time, the year itself became shorthand. Something people referenced without dates or names, just a glance and a nod that said enough. And the mountains kept doing what they had always done. Fog rolling in to erase distance, trees falling to block old paths, rain pulling everything downhill until even the most certain locations became guesses. And when the last of the men who'd been there grew old enough to talk, they didn't, because talking would have turned something settled into something open again. And nothing in those hills was more dangerous than reopening what the land had already closed. So the story stayed small on purpose, reduced to a single absurd sentence that outsiders could laugh at and locals could live with. That once, a long time ago, people killed over a missing dog. And the reason that line survived was because it carried the warning cleanly, that in the Smoky Mountains there were things you didn't lose, things you didn't accuse someone of taking, and things you never went looking for once the woods decided they were gone. By the early 1990s, even the people who had been young when it happened spoke about it as if it belonged to someone else's life. A borrowed memory passed down without ownership, and the roads where trucks once idled were paved just enough to invite strangers through without ever encouraging them to stop. And when a new sheriff took office, he was warned in a way that sounded like advice rather than instruction, that there were old situations best left unexamined, that pressing into them would only teach him how alone he could be. And he understood quickly, because understanding was how men stayed in their jobs there. And occasionally, someone would ask about missing persons from that year and be given answers that fit the paperwork but not the place. Explanations about hunting accidents and men who preferred the woods to town. And nothing in those answers was technically false. It just wasn't complete. And the completeness was the part that belonged to the mountains, not to records. And so the hunt of 1981 remained what it had always been. A closed circle with no center. A sequence of choices that felt logical only to those who lived inside them. And the missing dog became the story's smallest and most durable piece. Repeated because it was simple and unbelievable enough to distract from everything else. Because if people focused on the absurdity, they wouldn't ask about the structure that made it possible. And that was the final service the silence provided. Not protecting killers or condemning victims, but preserving a way of life that could not survive examination. And in that sense, the mountains got what they wanted. The truth weathered down until it blended into the landscape, indistinguishable from fog, from shadow, from the countless other things that went into those woods and never came back. And long after the last question stopped being asked, the habits remained, passed along without explanation. A pause before speaking certain names, a look toward the tree line before committing to a sentence, an understanding that some losses were not meant to be recovered, and when hunters brought dogs into those mountains afterward, they kept them closer. Not out of fear of predators, but out of respect for boundaries that had never been marked. And when one strayed and returned days later, muddy and thin but alive, its owner didn't celebrate. He loaded it into the truck and drove home without telling anyone. Because even survival could reopen things if handled wrong, and that was the lesson the Smokies enforced without ever stating it. That what happened in 1981 was not an exception, but a demonstration, a reminder that order there did not come from courts or reports or headlines. It came from consensus reached in darkness and maintained through omission. And the reason the story never fully disappeared was because it worked as intended. A small, unsettling anecdote that sounded exaggerated enough to dismiss but precise enough to warn. And so it stayed, unchanged, because changing it would have required someone to admit that the hunt had not been madness or accident or grief, but a deliberate act carried out step by step, night by night, until the mountains decided the balance had been restored. And once that decision was made, there was nothing left to investigate, nothing left to recover, and nothing left to say, except that in the Smoky Mountains in 1981, a dog went missing, and everything else followed exactly as it was always going to. What people outside never understood was that the ending had arrived long before the last man vanished, that the outcome was sealed the moment the loss was named and accepted by enough voices, and everything after that was simply procedure carried out without paperwork. And that was why there were no ghosts attached to it, no lingering outrage, no unresolved anger, only a quiet agreement that things had gone the way they were meant to. And if the story still unsettled those who heard it years later, it was because it exposed a logic that did not belong to them. A logic where prevention mattered more than mercy and silence mattered more than innocence. And the mountains enforced it without needing witnesses. And so the hunt was never remembered as violence but as correction. Never as crime but as closure. And that distinction, invisible on any map, was the reason nothing about 1981 ever truly ended. It simply settled into the ground like everything else the Smoky Mountains chose to keep. Several weeks before the hunt ever had a name, before anyone noticed who stopped showing up or which trucks moved after dark, there had already been signs that something was misaligned in that stretch of the Smokies. Small disturbances that meant nothing on their own, and everything in sequence. A gate left open where it never was. A shot heard too late in the evening to be for deer. A hound answering a call that wasn't meant for it. And men who had hunted the same ridges their whole lives noticed these things, the way sailors notice a change in wind, without comment but with adjustment. Because that land ran on familiarity, on knowing whose footsteps belonged where, and when the brindled dog began ranging farther than usual. It wasn't seen as disobedience, but as information, proof that something unfamiliar was moving through hollows that didn't tolerate it. And the owner mentioned it once on a porch, half joking, that the dog had been acting wrong, and the laughter that followed was thin, because everyone understood what acting wrong meant in a place where animals mirrored people. And over the next days, the dog came back later each night. Muddier, quieter, less eager to drink. And that alone would have been enough to start talk if it hadn't been paired with other things. With a fuel drum gone light. With traps sprung where no traps had been set. With a man seen crossing a line he'd never crossed before, and pretending not to know he'd done it. And none of this was reported, because reporting required certainty, and certainty was exactly what no one wanted to force too early. So instead, the information circulated sideways, from mouth to ear, from glance to nod, accumulating mass without direction. And by the night the dog failed to return, the idea of blame was already formed, not fixed to a person, but shaped, like one. And when morning came without tracks leading back, the silence felt deliberate, as if the woods had been consulted and had answered, and the men who gathered didn't do so in anger but in recognition, because something had been taken that marked territory without fences, something that proved presence without permission. And in that system, the loss itself was less dangerous than what it implied, that someone believed they could cross, take, and leave without consequence. And once that belief existed, it had to be corrected publicly, or it would spread. And so the hunt did not begin as violence but as maintenance, as a necessary tightening of boundaries that had gone slack. And every step that followed, every disappearance, every unasked question, fit into that logic cleanly enough that by the time anyone thought to challenge it, there was nothing left to interrupt, because the correction had already been completed, and the mountains, having been satisfied, returned to their usual quiet, leaving behind only the smallest possible explanation for something that had never been small at all. In the days after the dog vanished, the men most closely tied to the ridgeline adjusted without announcing it. Rifles cleaned earlier than usual, dogs kept leashed longer, routes altered just enough to avoid being predictable, because uncertainty was tolerated but weakness was not. And the first meetings were not meetings at all, just overlaps at places where paths crossed naturally, a barn entrance, a creek bend, a pull-off wide enough for 2 trucks to idle without blocking the road. And nothing was agreed to out loud, because agreement implied debate, and debate implied alternatives, and there were none once the assumption settled that the loss had not been accidental. And the sheriff heard the same thing from 3 different people that afternoon, each phrased differently but carrying the same weight, that there was no need for him to trouble himself, that things would be handled, and what made him step back wasn't fear but familiarity. The knowledge that pushing forward would not prevent harm but redistribute it, pulling it closer to town, closer to people who had not yet been named. And that evening, a man who had been seen too often near the wrong hollow made the mistake of explaining himself to someone who hadn't asked. And explanation, in that context, sounded like admission. And by nightfall his name was spoken clearly for the first time. Not shouted, not argued, simply placed. And placement was enough to start movement. Trucks rolling out in pairs, not to corner but to observe. To see which lights stayed on, which doors closed early, which dogs barked at familiar engines, and which stayed quiet. And the quiet ones mattered more, because animals noticed shifts faster than people. And by the second night, another name joined the first. Not because of evidence, but because proximity demanded it. Because being near a boundary when it was crossed made you responsible for the crossing. And responsibility was not something you declined. And the men being watched felt it before they understood it. A pressure that turned ordinary sounds sharp and made the woods feel closer, as if the mountains themselves were leaning in, and one of them tried to correct the situation. The only way he knew how, by offering restitution through intermediaries, an apology without confession. But the offer arrived too late because restitution acknowledged the rule after it had been broken, and the rule required acknowledgement beforehand. And by the 3rd night the watchers stopped watching and started moving with purpose, following paths that bypassed roads entirely, paths cut by hooves and habit rather than maps. And when the first man failed to appear the next morning, the reaction was not shock but recalibration, a tightening of expectations, because disappearance confirmed that the system was functioning, and once confirmed, it accelerated, not out of bloodlust, but efficiency, because prolonging correction only invited interference. And interference was the one outcome everyone agreed had to be avoided. And so the remaining names were addressed in order determined by access rather than guilt, by who could be reached without collateral attention, and as each absence registered, the community absorbed it quietly, understanding that acknowledging it too loudly risked reopening questions that had already been settled in practice. And through it all, the dog remained unmentioned, not because it was forgotten, but because it had served its purpose, the small, undeniable disruption that revealed where lines still existed and where they needed to be reinforced. And by the time the hunt concluded, there was no celebration, no relief, only the steady return of routines that signaled closure more clearly than any announcement could have. Fields worked again, dogs released again. Conversations resumed just far enough to be safe, and the mountains sealed what had been done not with secrecy, but with normalcy. The most effective form of erasure there was, making it clear that whatever had happened had been accepted, and acceptance in that place was the closest thing to an ending anyone would ever get. After that acceptance settled in, the remaining traces were administrative rather than physical, empty addresses quietly reassigned, equipment sold off without questions, a truck repainted and driven a different route, as if geography itself could be reset. And the sheriff closed his eyes to these shifts, not out of negligence but alignment. Because alignment kept the peace, and peace was the only metric that mattered once the correction had run its course. And when state officials later requested clarification, he gave them facts stripped of sequence, dates without context, men listed as last seen doing what they always did, hunting, driving, passing through, and those facts were technically accurate, which was why they held, and the community learned from it in ways no one articulated. Children taught indirectly where not to wander. Newcomers assessed carefully before being included. Favors weighed more precisely because favors, once owed, became liabilities, and years later when another dog went missing in a nearby county. The response was immediate and public. Flyers posted, calls made, law enforcement invited in loudly. Not because people had changed, but because they remembered what silence could become if allowed to organize itself. And that memory, more than guilt or fear, was what lingered from 1981, a collective understanding that systems like theirs worked best when they were never tested, and that testing them even over something small invited outcomes no one could later control. And so the Smoky Mountains carried the story forward not as a confession, but as a boundary marker, a quiet internal map drawn from absence and avoidance, ensuring that the hunt never needed to happen again in quite the same way, because everyone who had lived through it understood the cost of letting something trivial expose how final their rules really were. By the time a decade had passed, the hunt had become less a sequence of events than a reference point, something older men carried in posture rather than words, and younger ones sensed without being told, a gravity that settled over certain ridges and stretches of road where stories thinned out and voices dropped, and when someone new asked why a particular hollow was avoided, the answer came vague and practical. Bad footing, poor access, nothing worth seeing, and the explanation held because explanations only needed to satisfy outsiders, not the people who already knew. And the truth was preserved not through secrecy, but through consensus, through the quiet agreement that clarity would not improve anything, that naming would only fracture what had been repaired. And so the mountains continued to absorb the years the way they absorbed everything else, with weather and growth and erosion doing the work of forgetting without actually erasing. And every so often a fragment surfaced, a remark overheard at a counter, a warning disguised as humor, a look exchanged when a dog barked too long into the trees, and those fragments were enough, because they maintained the shape of the story without reopening it. And that shape was the real inheritance of 1981, the understanding that in places like that order did not announce itself and justice did not explain itself. It simply arrived, took what it required, and receded, leaving behind a normal that felt earned rather than questioned. And that was why, even years later, when someone repeated the line that men had been killed over a missing dog, it landed the way it did. Unsettling not because it sounded cruel, but because it sounded accurate. Because everyone who heard it could feel the larger machinery behind it. The unwritten rules, the accumulated patience, the readiness to act when those rules were tested, and in that sense the story never ended. It simply did what the Smoky Mountains always did with things they intended to keep. It folded itself into the terrain, indistinguishable from fog at a distance, unmistakable up close, and permanently out of reach once you tried to approach it directly. What ultimately endured was not fear, but calibration, a finely tuned sense of proportion that governed how far one could push before being pushed back. And that sense threaded itself into daily life so completely that it felt natural, inevitable, as if it had always been there. And in that way, the events of 1981 became less about the men who vanished and more about the behavior that followed, the way disputes were softened before they hardened, the way misunderstandings were corrected quickly and publicly, the way people learned to read the mountains as much as each other, because the mountains had demonstrated they would not arbitrate twice, and the lesson traveled outward quietly, passed between counties without attribution, until it became regional knowledge, an unspoken threshold everyone recognized, even if they couldn't define it. And when outsiders tried to frame it later as a failure of law, they missed the point entirely, because law had not failed so much as been rendered irrelevant by a system that measured stability differently, one that prioritized containment over correction and permanence over explanation. And that was why there were no anniversaries marked and no memorials erected, because memorials invite interpretation, and interpretation invites dispute. And dispute was the one thing the mountains would not tolerate once balance had been restored. And so the story settled into its final form, compact, unsettling, resistant to elaboration. A sentence that sounded absurd to anyone who didn't understand the terrain. That once in the Smoky Mountains, men were hunted over a missing dog, and the sentence survived, precisely because it carried just enough truth to function as a warning without ever revealing the machinery behind it, ensuring that the knowledge remained usable without becoming actionable, and that balance, maintained through omission and restraint, was the real legacy of the hunt. Not the absences it created, but the discipline it enforced. A discipline that outlasted the people involved and blended seamlessly into the landscape, where fog erased distance, roads bent away from certainty, and the mountains continued quietly to keep their own records. By the time those records had fully replaced memory, the people who carried first-hand knowledge were few enough to be indistinguishable from anyone else, their authority coming not from what they said, but from what they refused to elaborate on. And when pressed, they redirected conversation toward weather or work or the practical inconveniences of mountain life. Because practicality was the safest language available, and the disappearance of the men was folded into that same register, treated as something unfortunate but functional, a loss that served a purpose and therefore did not invite mourning in the usual way. And when a preacher once attempted to speak on forgiveness in connection with the year, his words landed wrong and were quietly set aside. Not because forgiveness was rejected, but because forgiveness required a confession, and confession would have demanded a narrative. And narratives created angles, and angles created sides, and sides were exactly what had been eliminated in 1981. And so even morality adjusted, not bending toward cruelty, but toward containment, toward the idea that the worst outcome was not violence, but exposure. And that lesson hardened over time into habit, shaping how disputes were resolved long after the original cause had faded. And that was why, decades later, when satellite maps made the region look accessible and harmless, when trails were logged and named and photographed, something still resisted entry, an intangible resistance that newcomers felt without understanding, a sense that the land tolerated presence but not inquiry. And when someone inevitably asked why certain hollows had no stories attached to them, why there were gaps where history should have been dense, The answer came back light and dismissive. Nothing ever happened there. And the statement was accepted because it had always been accepted, because it was easier to believe in emptiness than in systems that worked without witnesses. And that belief, sustained collectively, ensured that the hunt remained what it had been intended to be from the moment it started. A corrective action that left no open wounds, only a quiet realignment of behavior that made repeating it unnecessary. And in that way, the Smoky Mountains did what they had always done best. They took something violent and made it disappear, not by denying it, but by absorbing it so completely that it could no longer be separated from the ground itself, leaving behind a truth that was never written down and never needed to be, because everyone who mattered already knew exactly how close it still was.